Maspero's daughter married her fiancé, despite having huge misgivings about her suitor her parents had selected for her. Misgivings she frequently expressed when I read her tarot, both before and after the wedding. At the engagement party, it was announced that they would move in with his mother in Jakarta. This was not Maspero and his wife's plan, and they became very depressed. Like my mother, their attempt at control had gone horribly wrong. Maybe also, like my reaction to my mother, the daughter seemed to relish escaping this control. Thus, the not-so-happy couple moved to Jakarta with her daughter, who had always made me smile. If you remember, the new husband's mother and sister had died during the health crisis. Thus, they were alone in Jakarta. His mother had run a warung from the house, so this would provide them with a living, but it didn't. Nor could he find a job which paid enough in Jakarta to actually support his new family in Jakarta. This is something which became common during the health crisis and has not changed since the crisis ended. And maybe it will take some time for the Jakarta economy to find an equilibrium between prices and wages. Or maybe this is a flawed economic abstraction, and when the rich become even more greedy, the poor always suffer, the world over. It wasn't long before the still unhappy couple were forced to return to Gunung Kidul, much to Maspero and his wife's delight. But again this turned to despair when the daughter became pregnant once more. Like so many in Gunung Kidul, a health crisis had severely strained their ability to earn money, as had the stroke Maspero had suffered. But there were plenty of crops. Few people in Gunung Kidul go hungry. So the issue was that, like so many, they relied on powdered milk for their granddaughter and would also for the new baby. However, the cost is massive to subsistent farmers in Gunung Kidul, especially when times are hard. This is not helped by the daughter spending money intended for the baby milk on makeup. Shocking though this is, why blame the mother when it is the marketing and prices of baby milk that is the real sin? Also, in common with many in Gunung Kidul, they looked for new income sources and started a warung in the house, later selling chicken soup. So many people were opening similar businesses. Some have thrived. Some existing businesses could no longer compete, and most of these new businesses failed to live up to expectations. The hard times experienced by Maspero and his family were overwhelming. A few years previously, the soldier's son had been murdered by his comrades, and Maspero himself seemed to be suffering from a catalogue of stress-related illnesses. Indeed, such bad luck in Gunung Kidul is often seen as evidence of black magic. Certainly Maspero's half-brother was a dukun, whom he didn't appear to have a good relationship with him, nor did he with my dukun brother-in-law, who was also his stepbrother. I have to accept it is much the experience of black magic, with at least a little foul play. So many of the new businesses that were launched with great hope by their founders. But then what business isn't launched without hope? Buying new equipment and stock rather than redundant equipment and stock from the many newly bankrupted businesses. Unknown to me, these had been funded by bank loans. In Indonesia, banks and large businesses subcontract debt collection to debt collectors existing within a legal grey area. So many of these debt collectors being closer to gangsters than businesses. Thus there was an explosion in bad debt and local residents increasingly under pressure and therefore desperate to pay them off. On 2 occasions we bailed out Maspero and his family to save them from the debt collectors. But to my amazement, the money was repaid. Amazement, as money is never repaid in Indonesia, and Maspero and his family already owed money to many of their relatives. But it would seem that I had developed a reputation for being unforgiving over unpaid loans. largely due to having been burnt so many times. This reputation did not extend to others, and people calling to our home to ask for loans has become endemic, even people we don't know. But we never relented, as I know through bitter experience, that the best way to plunge me into depression and lose friendships, just as Ardesa seems to have been plunged into accusations and recriminations, thanks to irresponsible lending by the banks. It is now full of resentment over unpaid loans between residents, but the origin of the problem lies with the policies of the banks. People cannot live by lending money to one another. John Ruskin. The husband of Mas Perwa's daughter returned to Jakarta to work as a motorcycle taxi driver to support his new family. I believe him to be a good man, but know that old girlfriends are there to tempt him, and cannot be sure that this is a positive move. Maybe not desirable, but the brutal reality for young families from poor rural communities across Indonesia, and of course a brutal reality which has become even more restrictive for this poor man after losing his mother to the health crisis. Some years earlier, we'd refused to loan the dukun brother money for his youngest daughter's wedding to the son of another dukun from the main desa. Somehow he got the money for the most lavish wedding in our desa, but we did not witness it, being on holiday in Bali. He'd begged us to cancel our holiday, but all was non-refundable. This is typical of Indonesians who cannot desire to plan things in advance, and never give me any warning of what I'm expected to do. Nor do they seem at all concerned when they fail to show up for a meeting, which may have involved significant organisation for you to attend. Recently I was asked to attend the Bali Sol weekend, but I've already booked a non-refundable hotel in Jogja. I'd certainly have gone to Bali, despite my misgivings about the governor, but simply don't have the money to waste on non-usable hotel rooms. I did mention how Indonesians do everything at the last minute and have no concept of non-refundable bookings. At the time of writing, we're waiting to hear about dates and the city Titi's graduation ceremony will be held in. But it's next month and we're already halfway through this one. When we did return from our holiday in Bali, we found damage to our garden and its furnishing by the guests. Not soon after the wedding, the daughter suffered from a miscarriage. It was also not long after the miscarriage that the daughter and her husband moved to a distant suburb of Jakarta. Although broadly speaking in South Jakarta, where we lived. When we heard she was pregnant once more and experiencing some problems, we went to visit her with gifts of food. Although reasonably close to our home, it took a long time to reach by car. Titi had borrowed from her then boyfriend. Yes, everywhere takes a long time to get to in Jakarta, especially if you're travelling between neighbourhoods rather than into the centre or out of the city. Journeys into the city or out of the conurbation do take a long time, but nothing like the difficulty in getting across neighbourhoods. The small home was down a maze of gangs and we had to leave the car on the street. At first outside a convenience store, but we were told to move it to the street, which we did. On returning to the car, it had been damaged. It would seem that this is another business that has flourished in Jakarta due to the health crisis. Like visitors to Anfield in the 1970s, one has to pay local use to guard your car, or it be mysteriously damaged. But nobody approached us and they simply damaged the car. Whilst I'm sure that they needed the money, maybe a show of power was more important to them, especially a show of power over a foreigner who presumably should not be in Indonesia, let alone their campon. Indeed, such acts are more an act of patriotism than antisocial behaviour. The dukun's daughter seemed happy to see us with our gifts of food. All seemed okay, although later she gave birth to a Down syndrome girl, but not before they were forced to leave Jakarta and return to Gunung Kidul, as his wages were simply inadequate. Given that the dukun's brother had said that Maddie losing her mind brought shame on the family, and it was better that she should die. One has to see this as karmic. During the visit, it was mentioned that movements were heard in our home in Java, suggesting a rat infestation. In Jakarta, we live with rats, but in Java they're kept at bay by the snakes. Indeed, unlike our neighbour's home in Java, we've never had an infestation, despite during the crisis having been left empty for many months at a time. Sure enough, on return to Java, our home had a rat infestation. The damage was limited, but they needed removing, and we needed to remain vigilant. The dukun's brother's son aided us removing the rats, handling them with a little too much familiarity. Maddie spotted holes in the window grill where the rats had gained access. But on inspection, they were made by a very large rodent, using hand tools and a ladder. So we paid to have a more robust window grill fitted. Only a few days later, we returned from a night in Jogja to find more rats, and the new grill had also been damaged, seemingly by a long sharpish instrument like a chisel. Amazing what these rodents can master. While something to an end of the rat infestation, we could still hear them in our bedroom. Although there were some rat droppings in the wardrobe, there were no other signs. After many months of hearing the rats and a few droppings in the wardrobe, but too few, we solved the mystery. We discovered that a single rat had gained access to our roof and then dropped down to avoid between the ceiling and the built-in wardrobe. Unfortunately, the solution was to block the void, the rat presumably dying of thirst. Fortunately and amazingly, there was no smell. Very fortunate, in fact, as once a home has had a rat infestation, others are likely, probably because they can smell their tracks. We remain vigilant but hopeful. Another time we arrived home to find a dead snake in our home. Again, we have to suspect foul play, but I doubt if anyone had access to our home, but could have encouraged a small snake through the gaps between our doors and the floor, and it subsequently died of thirst. As it's now the hot season when most snakes hibernate, we have to hope that this was the only one and that there aren't other snakes hiding in our home. But the most heartbreaking was the day when we left Gunung Kidul for Jakarta. Lucky the cat who had befriended us was found dead. He did not come to see us for food that evening, nor the next morning, which had already made me suspicious. Neither Yanni nor the owner believed his injuries were from being run over, but having a leg broken, then being repeatedly hit in the face. You could call it torture or maybe a black magic ritual. Maddie cried that she no longer has a friend in Gunung Kidul, and I feel the same. And that is exactly what the reaction was meant to be. But when Maddie asked Parkano, he told us that Lucky had indeed been killed in a road accident, and I certainly witnessed him chasing motorcycles. Somehow I didn't believe Parkano, but felt that he knew that this was designed to take away our positivity, making us susceptible to black magic attack. In previous books I've mentioned Gödel's incompleteness theorems, and how for me they mean that something can be completely true, and untrue simultaneously. Well, is this an example? Everything is on a probability or potentiality curve, but this particular issue has more of a binorm than a normal distribution. What I'm saying is that we can co-create a benevolent world by not believing the brother to have been involved, or a more sinister world by believing that he was. After all, I have talked so much about how fear gives rise to much negativity. This is a practical example of New Age's called positive thinking and the law of attraction, but a much deeper level than I've heard any consider. Once again, it seemed to me that understanding the statistics and identifying the type of distribution are essential to co-creation, and in particular manifesting. Once we can identify the distribution, we're able to identify the polarities or granularities and then transmute them. Could this be a warning about digital technology? For digital technology and digital thinking are binormal. Not that in itself is problematic, only when it shoehorns the analogue, including analogue thinking, into the digital, making zealots of us all. Perhaps I can best illustrate this with light dimmer switches. They're not analogue, as we all believe, but digital, continually switching lights on and off. Fluorescent lights can also have a switching effect, and I've always felt unnerved in a fluorescent environment. Normally we cannot perceive these switches, but could they actually be harming us by not giving us a continuous stream of light? This is pure conjecture, but instinctively I believe it to be true. Imposing digital technology and thinking on us makes us all easier to control, for we can be predicted by being at one place on the poles, the on and off, the 0 or the 1, when so much of the natural world is analogue and has a normal distribution. Thus, digital thinking takes us further away from our ability to co-create, delivering us to others who seek to control us. The damage to our grills seemed to fit a pattern of minor damage when we left our home in Gudunkeedle, including the damage to a garden and garden furnitures. Perhaps the most disturbing was theft of tools from a garden shed. The shed had been built by Mass Predictor when he and Booty lived with us. Eventually there were no tools left in the shed, but we placed a lock on it anyway. But then the shed itself started to be vandalised, enabling access despite the lock. I suggested pulling it down, but Maddie very sensibly said, let them demolish it. Although chairs, benches and garden ornaments also seemed to be being vandalised. Nothing too expensive, but the constant finding of damage was becoming suspicious, to say the least. We also became aware that our neighbours were fearful of the Dukun brother and his family. They had apparently been warning others off from visiting our home. As Maddie and I are rather private people who never enjoy small talk and gossip, this wasn't really a problem, but it was clearly designed to isolate us within Edessa, a tactic I'm all too aware of from suffering from a lifetime of narcissistic abuse. This all reminds me of the activities of semi-criminal families who come to terrorise working class areas in the UK's towns and cities. Like Paete in Jakarta, their fellow residents live in fear of them. Unlike Paete, they rarely hold a formal position of leadership. And unlike Paete, their authority seems to be based on petty nuisance and threats of violence rather than the use of magic.